Okay. Hey. Hi, my name is Paul. I am a philosopher in training uh, and jazz enthusiast living in LA, getting my PhD at UCLA. I met Katie during undergrad. We were in a couple of classes together. And here we are talking about, I guess, some things I like, which include philosophy and jazz, and we might get to both of these.
Amazing. So what was your path like becoming a philosopher? We're always philosophers in training, but more specific to academics.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me, philosophy comes from math, which is what I was nerding out about in high school.
Okay.
And through my nerding out about black holes and about the foundations of arithmetic and so on, I kind of by chance happened upon some writings by philosophers on this topic, on these topics. And I was kind of quickly drawn to the kind of abstraction in thought and the methods of philosophy. And so I played around with logic and math and philosophy for a little while, up until like maybe the first year of undergraduate, at which point I also discovered that there was this thing called the humanities, which I became very fascinated by. And so I guess I took a detour through the art history department and the English department and the history department before ending up in philosophy again as what felt like my intellectual home, mainly because of the kinds of, the ways that the questions were addressed and the kinds of questions that were raised. And so maybe the second half of my undergraduate degree was almost entirely focused on philosophy. And I liked it so much and also thought that I did such a poor job at learning it in undergrad that I should go and do some more in graduate school.
Which is
So
awful
that's
for me
the
to hear because you were always prepared in class and I was never prepared in class. And like now I feel like I have to do a PhD because just listening to you talk about these things. But now I guess specifically, so you're doing a lot of work on philosophy of mind. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm becoming interested in the philosophy of mind. During undergraduate, I was mostly interested in ethics from various perspectives. Coming to UCLA, so UCLA has a long tradition of involvement with a tradition of philosophy that reaches back to the early 20th century that had very close ties to a group of scientifically minded philosophers, the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists. And a lot of these people's views are now outdated and just clearly wrong, but maybe their most lasting impact, at least at UCLA, was a kind of respect for the methods of science and a conception of philosophy as a discipline that is closely allied to science. And I've been really enjoying getting to know about the mind at UCLA in philosophy because in some ways it's a return to an engagement with science that I had, 6-7 years ago back in high school and early college, which I haven't had in all my time doing ethics. Now more specifically, right now I'm learning about the ways in which what we think, the contents of our minds, depends on the social and the physical, but more interestingly, the social environment that we find ourselves in.
And I think that's so interesting. So I personally came to philosophy through philosophy of mind. I started reading Douglas Hofstadter stuff when I was in high school. It was really important to me. It was like my entire life. I was like, wow, this is so cool. And that's what my undergrad and grad degree were in. We're in philosophy of mind and then philosophy of language because I ran out of philosophy of mind classes. And I think it's really interesting. The classes that were most exciting to me were the ones that weren't purely philosophy, that were the ones that were in conversation with other sciences. So you can't answer all of the philosophy of mind classes without a neuroscience understanding, or at least you can't do it fully, in my opinion. So I think hearing about that is like incredibly exciting, that there's programs out there that are like very much modern and intertwined with the sciences too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. There's such a thing as a scientism, and it's to be resisted. But there's such a thing as being wrong about the natural world, and being in conversation with science can help you avoid that too, which is also to be resisted. And people here do it very well, and so I'm happy
So I want to talk a little bit about music too, which is another one of your interests, jazz specifically, but I guess music generally. How do you think that your kind of like experience as a human who's interested in, philosophy and the humanities and everything has really helped form your appreciation of music?
Again, a very good question. So the perspective I have on music that is the most philosophical, I think, has to do with what I think about the expressive potential of music. So I guess I want to say most of what I think and do with music is pretty disconnected from philosophy, at least in the way that I see philosophy is taking place. And it's very hedonistic. I think there's a kind of pleasure that you can get from music, which is its own thing and which is very distinct from the kind of pleasure you can get in any other way. Similarly with literature and with food and so on. These pleasures have their own distinct characters. And I think that's maybe an interesting object for philosophical study, but it's not philosophical engagement with the music itself. I do think that there's something philosophically significant about music, which is that it has a kind of expressive potential that I think is also distinct on its own. And I think the study of the expressive potential of various mediums is very philosophically interesting. So as an example, you might think language has certain expressive capacities, which pictures don't have. Right. Pictures have certain expressive capacities that language doesn't have. Diagrams are, again, a third thing. Maps are another one. These all manage to represent the world in their own particular way. And they each have limitations and capacities that the others don't. And I think music is another one. And I think one thing that music is extremely good at doing is representing or portraying emotions. Yep. You can do so in a way, I think, that is way more nuanced and way more penetrating than language can, and probably also than visual mediums can, I think, but that may just be my own bias.
I don't think so. I think, I mean, as someone who is a visual artist and not a musician and like is solely in the wheelhouse of like colors, literally, I think like I can learn more and feel more from a 3-minute song about someone's experience than I can reading an entire novel. And that's like, I think, a universal experience. I think everyone feels that way. And I think that also brings it back to an interesting like philosophy of mind connection, which is that we have very different regions of our brain that are responsible for processing different stimuli. And it might just be that like, we haven't done enough research on like the music part of the brain and how it connects to emotions rather than, the visual systems or whatever.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of literature on the way that we process visual information. There's obviously literature on how we hear things, but I think the distinctively perceptual component of our hearing, not just the mechanics of it, but the way in which what we hear represents things, especially in any way that like you end up finding relevant to things you might care about in music, like emotions and right. Perspectives. Yeah, I think there's so much more to do on that, and it would be so exciting.
I talked briefly before this about this book called "This Is Your Mind on Music" or "This Is Your Brain on Music," and it's this kind of conversation, and I think it's important to have more research on this because it's good to know about the science is researching things like emotions, which are arguably the most important thing of human experience, which gets not a ton of attention, sadly.
They're up there for me.
So do you play music?
Yeah, I play mostly bass. I have like rudiments in drum and guitar and piano, I guess. Even less so in piano, but I mostly bass.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that's one thing I think is great about playing music, even if you do it terribly, which I would say I do, is it enables a kind of interaction you can have with music that's very akin to close reading in the case of literature, which I think is very rewarding. And a lot of people don't, well, I shouldn't generalize about this. My untutored opinion is that a lot of people don't engage with music in this close reading kind of way where you listen to like a single passage again and again and you try to figure out together. But playing an instrument and trying to figure out how to play something, really teaches you that.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing. And so I think we'll leave off there because we are out of time. But it was so good to talk to you about these things. I miss having these conversations in person, like hanging out at EBF and all the other places. And, you know, it's good to just be able to talk about these things freely and openly.
A pleasure.
Ah,